And I really think you will enjoy this material here. Okay? Andrew Jackson, the man. Andrew Jackson was actually born on the Carolina frontier in 1767. He was born on the Carolina frontier, which would be the western part of the Carolinas, in 1767. And he was the son of immigrant parents. Anybody want to guess where they immigrated from? Good guess. Actually, Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland. So Andrew Jackson was born on the Carolina frontier in 1767, and he was the son of immigrant parents from Northern Ireland. Now, interesting enough, he grew up with basically no formal schooling whatsoever. Grew up with basically no formal schooling whatsoever. And he was often made fun of, we might call it bullied in today's terms. He was often made fun of because he couldn't spell very well, and he wore really odd backwoods clothing. So he was often made fun of because of the fact he couldn't spell at all very well, and he wore odd backwoods clothing. Well, after growing up in the frontier life, he decided to move east to become a lawyer, which is kind of interesting when you think that he grew up with no formal schooling whatsoever. So he grows up in the backwoods of Carolina. He leaves the frontier when he's old enough, and he moves east and decides he's going to become a lawyer. And if to become a lawyer, you have to do what? Well, you have to study law. Well, they didn't really have, he wasn't going to qualify, or they didn't have a lot of law schools at that time. So who would you study law under? Another lawyer. And the man that he chose was a fellow by the name of Spruce McCay. And he was a very famous lawyer in Salisbury, North Carolina. So Jackson grows up on the frontier. He moves east because he wants to become a lawyer. And he studies under the tutelage of a famous lawyer by the name of Spruce McCay in Salisbury, North Carolina. And if you spell Salisbury, it's S-A-L-I-S-B-U-R-Y. S-A-L-I-S-B-U-R-Y. North Carolina. So he studies law under the famous Spruce McCay in Salisbury, North Carolina. Well, after he finished his studies with Spruce McCay, he moved to Tennessee and lived in a boarding house, and he began to practice law. So after his studies with Spruce McCay, he moves to Tennessee, moves into a boarding house, and he starts his law practice. What's a boarding house, Lee Harvey Oswald? You'll learn about that. What's a boarding house? Anybody know? Lee Harvey Oswald lived in a boarding house during the time he assassinated President Kennedy. What a boarding house is someone that has a big house with maybe 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 rooms in it. And a person rents out the room for a certain amount of money, and what comes with that is the lady that owns the house feeds you the meals, maybe takes care of your laundry, those types of things. Dusts your room. Kind of like a bed and breakfast, but not near as fancy. Okay? So he moves into a boarding house and starts to practice law. Well, it was kind of interesting. When he got there, he fell in love with the woman. He fell in love with the daughter of the woman who owned the boarding house. Okay? While he's there, he falls in love with the daughter of the woman who owns the boarding house. Now, this young lady was a very attractive young lady. She was very well educated, and she spoke her mind, which was a little bit unusual in those days. And because of those three attributes, Jackson really liked her. He liked the fact that she was pretty, which is pretty easy to figure out. He liked the fact that she was educated, and he really liked the fact that she would speak her own mind. And he liked that about her, so he instantly fell in love with her. Her name was Rachel Donaldson Robards, which is on your ID sheet. Rachel Donaldson Robards. This was the young lady he fell in love with that was the daughter of the lady that owned the boarding house. Rachel Donaldson Robards.
Strike anybody as real odd.
Why? No, actually that was her maiden name.
So she was married?
She was married.
That was the problem. She was actually married. So, this really became an issue. Well, yeah, you knew that. It became an issue because she was married. Now, there's a story behind it.
Is this where you fit in?
No, good guess, though, no. So she's married. Well, think about it. Now, I'm not trying to promote divorce or remarriage, but if they like each other, what kind of a marriage could she have? It was a bad marriage. Matter of fact, her husband was very physically abusive. Okay? So she was in a bad marriage. Rachel was in a very bad marriage. And her husband, who really wasn't around that much on top of that, when he was home, was pretty verbally abusive. Physically and verbally. How about these stats? He was a bad man. Yeah, abusive. There you go. So, she was in a bad marriage. Her husband wasn't around a lot, but when he was around, he was both physically and mentally abusive. Okay? So, being he wasn't around a lot, in 1790, Rachel moved herself to Mississippi, which at the time was owned by Spain. So by 1790, Rachel had enough of her bad marriage, and she moved to Spanish-owned Mississippi without her husband. 1790. She moved to Spanish-owned Mississippi without her husband. But guess who was a frequent visitor? Andrew Jackson. He was a frequent visitor. Well, in 1791, claiming Rachel's husband had divorced her, the couple married in Mississippi. So in 1791, claiming that Rachel's husband had divorced her, the couple married in Mississippi. 1791. So in 1791, claiming that Rachel's husband had divorced her, the couple remarried, or said they did anyway. Now, at the time, guess who the only person that could actually perform a legal marriage was? Catholic priest. And there wasn't any Catholic priests in Mississippi, so a lot of people had the perception that that marriage was not legal. Whoever did it couldn't have done it legally because there weren't any Catholic priests in Mississippi. So it caused some controversy. If marriage caused controversy, as only a Catholic priest could legally marry a couple at the time. But they said they were married. And they said that she was divorced. Well, after their marriage, they moved to Nashville, Tennessee, where they bought a small plantation which included 15 slaves. So after their, quote, marriage in Mississippi, Andrew and Rachel moved to Nashville, Tennessee, where they purchased a small plantation with 15 slaves. Well, this is kind of an interesting story, so you might have to listen to it to understand it. Well, in 1793, Rachel's husband claimed he did not divorce her. Claimed he did not divorce her. And he accused her of what? Adultery. Now, the weird thing about the law at that time is if your husband or wife committed the other of adultery, you were automatically divorced. So that was probably kind of a dumb move on his part if he was interested in rekindling, you know, the old flame. So, in 1793, Rachel's husband claimed he did not divorce Rachel and accused her of adultery. Well, that claim of adultery at the time legally made a divorce final. Okay? So it actually worked out. So as a result, what did Rachel and Andrew do again? this time legally in Tennessee with a Catholic priest performing the ceremony. So they remarried, if you even want to call it that. They married again, and this time in a legal ceremony in Tennessee. So they are now husband and wife after all that. Now Jackson really didn't like the plantation life too much, so he decided he would enter politics. Really didn't like the plantation life all that much, so he decided he would enter politics. And in 1796, at the age of just 29, he was appointed to the U.S. House of Representatives from what state? Tennessee. He was appointed, not elected. He was appointed to the U.S. House of Representatives from Tennessee. And that happened in 1796. This is kind of an interesting story after this. So in 1796, at the age of 29, he's appointed to the U.S. House of Representatives. Well, he served 1 year in the House, and then he served 1 year in the Senate, and then he just went back to Nashville to his plantation. So he served 1 year in the House and 1 year in the Senate, and then just left and went back to his plantation in Nashville. What was the reason? He did not have what historians call a legislative personality. We're going to try to define that for you. He did not have a legislative personality. So what he did is he left, served a year in the House, a year in the Senate, went back to Nashville because, according to historians, he did not have a legislative personality. Now, what do you have to have if you have a legislative personality? You have to be able to do what with others? Play well with others. And he was not very good at that. He was not very good at playing well with others. He wasn't, ironically, very political. You know, you hear about, well, that happened because of politics, or politics always makes a decision on this or that. Well, he didn't have a legislative personality. He didn't like to play well with others. It just wasn't him. He was not very political, despite the fact that he's going to be pretty ingrained in politics. But he's going to do it his own way. Well, at the age of 31, he became a circuit judge in Tennessee's Superior Court. At the age of 31, Jackson becomes a circuit judge in Tennessee's Superior Court. Remember, right? Each state is going to have what? A court system, right? He became the judge in that Tennessee's court system. And he did very well. He gained more and more respect from the people of Tennessee. They really liked him. They liked him so much, they appointed him Major General of what?
Militia.
The militia. Very good. So he was very well liked as a circuit judge in Tennessee. And because of that popularity, he was appointed Major General of the Tennessee Militia. We talked about that, didn't we? A little bit. Well, in 1804, he resigned as the circuit court judge and went back to his plantation. So he really doesn't know what he wants to do, does he really? I mean, so in 1804, he quits his job as circuit judge, which he did quite well at, and went back to his plantation. What's that? We'll see. We'll see. Now, he had other people, which we'll talk about, running the plantation, but when he went back, he started to oversee the general operations. He was kind of taking attention on what was being done. He didn't run it, but he oversaw the general operations and his whiskey distilleries. So that's what he went back to kind of keep an eye on. Although, you understand that he wasn't running the plantation, and we'll tell you who is later. But he goes back after his circuit judge days and decides to kind of oversee the general operations of his plantation, paying special attention to his whiskey distilleries. He was no different than those other guys that were growing corn, right? And putting it into whiskey and sending it, okay? But he also went back to his plantation to continue his real passion. And he had to be back on the plantation to do that. And his real passion was what? Anybody know what he liked to do? My passion is fishing. I love to fish I love to camp. I have a passion, I love history. His passion was the breeding and racing of horses. He was really into the breeding and racing of horses. That's really why he went back to plantation. To oversee the general operations of the plantation and to check out his whiskey distilleries to make sure they were doing well. But he really wanted to go back to take up his passion of breeding and racing of horses. Well, what'd they do in those horse races? Bet. Well, in 1806, an attorney by the name of Charles Dickinson, who was also a horse owner and racer, insulted Jackson on a dispute over a bet on a horse race. Yeah, I'll read it again. In 1806, an attorney by the name of Charles Dickinson, who was also a horse owner and a horse racer, insulted Andrew Jackson in a dispute over a bet on a horse race. Insulted him on a dispute over a race. Attorney by the name of Charles Dickinson, also a horse owner and racer, insulted Jackson in a dispute over a bet on the horse race. Well, it got kind of nasty and it got personal, and pretty soon Dixon called Jackson's wife, Rachel, an adulteress. And Jackson didn't like it much, and he immediately challenged him to a duel. That's how you settle disputes in those days. So Charles Dickinson's getting in a big brouhaha with Andrew Jackson over this bet on a horse race, and he takes it too far, and he calls Jackson's wife, Rachel, an adulteress. And Jackson responds by challenging him to a duel. Now that was pretty risky, because Dickinson was without doubt the best shot in Tennessee. Best shot in Tennessee, no question. Had a reputation as the best shot in Tennessee. So similar to what Mason and I were thinking about the other day, Jackson's got to come up with a strategy. And he comes up with a risky and daring plan for the duel. Okay, he's got to come up with a strategy and a plan. And it's pretty risky what he decides to do. Now we know the rules of duels, although I was a little, I didn't quite follow them, and Mason sure as heck didn't. But the rule is, you go your 10 paces in turn and choose to fire in the air, whatever, okay? But you can't move from that position. Now Jackson decided he was going to allow Dickinson to fire first. And if he survived, he was going to be able to take the careful aim he needed, because he wasn't as good a shot, and shoot back. So that was the strategy that Jackson decided to use in this duel with Charles Dickinson. That he would allow Dickinson to fire first, and he figured if he survived, he could take his time and take careful aim and shoot, because Dickinson would have to stand there. He couldn't run, right? If he did, then the Kyle Lamb of the world would have shot him. Okay? So, they get lined out, they go on their 10 paces, Dickinson fires first, hits Jackson, missing his heart by less than an inch. No, this is a true story. This isn't like folklore. So during the duel, Dickinson did fire first. He hit Jackson, and he missed Jackson's heart by less than an inch. And the bullet actually lodged in Jackson's rib cage, about an inch from his heart. Tough old bird. Struck. He pressed his left hand over the wound to control the bleeding, took careful aim, fired, and killed Dickinson. True story. Pressing the wound to control the bleeding, Jackson takes careful aim, fires, and kills Dickinson. No kid, true. Tough old bird. Well, he took the next 3 months off to recover, but kept the bullet for the rest of his life. I don't know if it was, I think it came out, he kept it. He kept it. He didn't keep it in his chest, he kept it. So he took the next 3 months to recover from his wound, and he kept the bullet for the rest of his life. So he's kind of a busy guy, so he's got to do something during his recovery. And what he does, he starts studying military strategies, because after all, what is he?
Militia.
He's the Major General of the Tennessee Militia. He's not really caught up on warfare and military strategies. They gave him the job because they liked him. So he basically spends 3 months studying military strategies so he can better himself for his position of Major General in the militia. So he spends his time studying so he can be effective. Now, I didn't tell you this story, but did General Jackson actually march from Tennessee to New Orleans to defend that city? Right? And he was successful in the War of 1812. We talked about that. He actually was ordered twice to New Orleans. And this is what happened. After his recovery, he and his Tennessee militia were ordered to New Orleans because they were expecting this British attack upon the city. Okay? And he marched his men about 300 miles from Tennessee to New Orleans, and then they canceled the campaign. So he's obviously going to be called back again for the real deal that we talked about, right? But they actually called him once. He marched his men about 300 miles towards New Orleans, and after they marched that 300 miles, they just basically got word to him that they canceled the campaign, and he was to go back to Tennessee, wait for further instructions. Well, the government, when Jackson said, well, what do I do with my men? The government says, well, you just release them, and they're on their own to get back. We're not paying for it. They're on their own, at their own expense, which made Jackson very angry. So when Jackson gets word that they canceled this mission, so to speak, and he's told that his men are to return to Tennessee on their own at their own expense, he doesn't like it much. So even though he could have gotten on a ship and taken the Mississippi River back home and left his men